Hello and welcome to this in-depth video of the yarn Lexquis available in my shop. Exquis is French for exquisite, and this is the name given to a yarn which is a blend of merino wool, silk and cashmere. As I record this video, I haven't designed any patterns for the yarn yet, and what I want to share with you here is my prep work for designing with yarn. I swatch to get to know any new yarn, and in this case the Exquis yarn, and this makes me understand what I can use it for. And perhaps this will also give you some ideas on how you can use this beautiful yarn. So let's start to see how this yarn behaves when it's knitted. When I start to learn to know a new yarn, I tend to start by making a knitted swatch. And the first thing I try to see is to decide on the needle size I would like to knit it with. This will also give me interesting information about the hook size I would use to crochet the same yarn. So this is a first approach to the yarn, and I start generally with the needle size recommended by the manufacturer. And for this yarn, oops, sorry about that stray cable. For this yarn, the mill suggested a 3.5 millimeter needle. As you see, I attach a label to my unblocked swatch where I indicate the different needle sizes I use to work the swatch. And as I said, and as you can see, my swatch is unblocked and the ends are not woven in. So I started with a 3.5 millimeter needle, which is a US 4. I first worked a bit of stockinette and then some garter stitch. This yarn has a silk core, which means that it's less elastic than it would have been if it contained only wool or merino wool and cashmere in case of this yarn. So it will behave a bit differently, because the silk, while being an animal fiber, it's less elastic. And this is something you can see here in the garter stitch quite clearly, because it's harder. I find it harder, most people find it harder to work an even garter stitch in a less elastic yarn. So this is a bit uneven. And this, if you're a knitter, you might have noted this, for example, if you have worked garter stitch in a cotton yarn, which is less elastic as well. And while I think that this garter stitch has a nice personality, I wanted to see how, if it couldn't be a bit more even when worked with a different needle. And in the stockinette part, as expected, this yarn works a bit like a mohair and silk blend. What I mean by that is that the fluffy fibers, which are here cashmere, fill the stitches. And what we can see here, if you look closely, is there is less space between the stitches than inside the stitches. The inside of the stitches have been held open by the needle, and in a kind of way this looks like an upside down stockinette stitch, but I don't think that's really a problem. So I wanted to see how this very lightweight yarn would behave when worked on a smaller needle size. So you will find all the details about the yarn in the description box below, but let's just note that this is yarn with 275 meters in a 50-gram ball. So that's really lightweight, and I would expect it to work well with a smaller needle. Here I didn't do anything extreme because I don't really want to work with a very small needle size, especially in this yarn, which is very soft and I don't really plan to use for, say, socks or gloves. So I simply went down to a 3mm needle, which is between a US size 2 and 3. In stockinette, this gave me a fabric which is a bit more stable and dense. It can be hard to see here, but if I put my hand behind the swatch, you might be able to see that the stockinette is denser. I also find it a bit more even. And if I compare the garter stitch worked with the 3mm needle at the top here, with the garter worked with a larger needle at the bottom, I personally find that the garter stitch work a bit more tightly is more successful. And that's a personal preference. Both versions could work and could be used depending on the fabric you want to achieve. So this is why I decided on a compromise to work the remaining part of the swatch on a 3.25mm needle, which is a US size 3. And of course I could have stopped at this point, but I wanted to see if I could combine the XG yarn with other yarns available in my shop. So first I combined it with itself. I knitted a few stripes in the same yarn but in another color. And as you might see, the stripes are clear, but with the fussiness of the cashmere, the lines are slightly blurred, and I think this gives the stripes a more delicate touch, and this is something I liked a lot. It gives another personality to this very simple pattern. Next, I wanted to see if I could combine this yarn with other yarns that I sell and use them in the same design project. And since this is a very lightweight yarn, I wanted to test how it would work with other laceweight yarns. I didn't block the swatch, and this is not only because I'm lazy, but it's also so that differences between the different yarns will show up in the swatch. And you can especially see it at the selvage. As you might see, especially here on the left. I wanted to check if Lixki would work side by side with my laceweight wool and silk yarn called London. With the wool and silk content in the London yarn, it seemed to be a good match. The London yarn has actually less yardage than the XG yarn. 25 grams of London is 200 meters, while 25 grams of XG is 275 meters. So essentially the London yarn is thicker. However, the London yarn is smooth and you can see that it fills out less than the XG yarn. This makes me think that this might be a combination that would be a bit tricky to use. I would need to carefully consider the stitch pattern and yarn placement. And of course, this is very interesting information to me as a designer. In the last part of this swatch, I wanted to try the combination with another yarn. And I choose the Genghis Khan yak down yarn produced in France, which is also available in my shop. At a first glance, the yak yarn is clearly heavier weight, but as you can see, it behaves very well as a companion to the Exki yarn. And the selvage is straight and it's not going in or out. It's much smaller with the London yarn, but with the yak down it works. And I really like this combination. The fiber content is different in the two yarns, but yak down is also a noble fiber. So I consider it to be a very worthy companion to the wool, silk and cashmere Exki. As you can see, I changed colors as well. The yak is only available in natural undyed colors, and I wanted some contrast and pop to make it more inspirational. Sorry. Inspiration is also very, very important when you design with yarn. So this first swatch gave me a lot of information about the needle sizes that are suitable. This doesn't mean that I'll never use another needle size with this yarn, but I know a lot more about what I can expect using needles of different sizes. And as we've already said, I've also tested the stripes and different possible yarns to use with this one. What I haven't done here, but will certainly do, is to work the Exki yarn in double with other yarns. One strand of Exki worked at the same time as one strand of another yarn. This way I will obtain a thicker and really cozy fabric, but we'll see. That's for another time. Next, I wanted to see how this yarn would work up using different knitted stitch patterns. For this part of the video, I have been largely inspired by the Swatch Lab videos by Barbara Benson. She's an American knitwear designer, and you will find the link to her YouTube channel in the description box. I really enjoy following Barbara, who is a great designer with very interesting knitting patterns. The swatch she uses in her Swatch Lab videos is not identical to this one, but I was inspired by the swatch she uses to demonstrate how yarn behaves using different stitch patterns. This yarn is so fine, I think you can see the stitches a bit better if I put my hands behind the swatch. And this was also knitted on a 3.25mm needle, and I started with a lace pattern. Not very surprisingly, the Exki yarn works really well in lace. The stitch definition is good and the delicate character of the yarn shines through. This is a lace pattern where the decreases are placed rather far from the yarn overs, and this creates a kind of movement in the fabric. I think that for this yarn I want to choose this type of lace pattern, where you can see really how the stitches move with the tension created by the decreases. These slanted stitches that seem to travel over the fabric look really interesting in this yarn. So next we have a small transition in garter stitch. And after that I wanted to test a small motif in twisted stitches. I thought the motif might get lost in the fuzziness of the cashmere, but I honestly think that this little shape shows off quite well. However, I'm not really convinced by the contrast between the reverse stockinette inside the shape and the stockinette background. I honestly don't think it's worth the effort to use these two different stitches using this yarn. And this is something we can confirm over here, where I've worked a little bit of ribbing. And you can hardly see that there's ribbing here. It looks more like very loose stitches than alternating knits and purls. These two patterns give me the indication that I'm not very likely to use this yarn for textured stitch patterns based on knits and purls. Next, on this side of the swatch, I worked a small cable. This was a nice surprise. The textured stitch patterns don't really show off that well. And since cables are a kind of textured stitch pattern, even if they are made in a very different way, well, I didn't expect to like this cable as much as I do. Just like in the lace pattern down here, there are stitches that sort of move over the fabric, and they are really clear, and I think it's beautiful. And the silk core in this yarn really underlines them. The light is reflected by the silk, and frankly, I just might soon cast on something knitted for that will contain cables in this X-key yarn. And I finished this smorgasbord of a swatch with a few rows of moss stitch. And the texture, well, of course it's different from the 4 rows of garter stitch down here. But, well, once again, I find that this kind of stitch isn't very convincing in this yarn. And let's just say that it's not the direction I'm going to take when designing using the X-key yarn. And as I said previously, I will also try to work this with a strand of another yarn on a larger needle for a squishier fabric. And then perhaps my opinion on textured stitches with X-key will be very different. So that's for the knitting. Let's have a look at how this works up in crochet. I swatched a bit less in crochet since I learned a lot about the yarn when knitting the previous swatches. And this also informs how I will use it in crochet. So this is the crochet swatch I use as a base, comparable to a knitted swatch in stockinette. To make a basic crochet swatch, I work double crochet in the front loop only, working back and forth. And I immediately choose a 3.5mm crochet hook, and I think that's a really good size for this yarn, at least for a stitch pattern based on double crochets. The fabric is much fuzzier since the yarn makes more turns and twists in a crochet stitch than in a knitted stitch. The cashmere fills the rows and the stitches much more, but in my opinion, the delicate and transparent characteristics of the yarn are preserved. I'm going to use this hook size, so a 3.5mm hook, as a starting point for what I'm going to make and crochet with this yarn. What I also learned from this swatch was that it wasn't super easy to work under one loop only using this yarn. It's feasible, of course, but the halo of the yarn makes it harder to get under that loop. And so I think I will search for stitch patterns where you work mainly into chain spaces when I design with this yarn. This is because I think it will be easier and more enjoyable, and that's actually really the point of crocheting. So you might find it easier than I did to work under one loop only, of course, so make your own opinion on this. And here I have a final crochet swatch to show you, because crochet, of course, is so often worked as motifs in the round. And here I made a small motif, also with the 3.5mm hook, to see how it would work. And it's of course also an opportunity to test other stitches than just plain double crochet. And here we have some double crochet clusters. I really like the result of this. It shows off the halo of the yarn, the fuzziness, and it also gives it some substance. And this motif is finished with chain arches that are really delicate. I found that the yarn is really beautiful used this way. However, I think it will be important to carefully consider where to place chain arches in a potential design, because they are so delicate that you wouldn't want to snag on them too easily. So perhaps not huge chain arches in the border. I really loved crocheting this yarn. It works beautifully and easily, and I can only recommend you try it out. So this was a video to show you the swatches I made so far in this yarn. I hope this will be useful and that this gives you some information on how you could use the X-ski yarn or a similar one. Perhaps you don't agree with my conclusions at all, and perhaps you have a completely different opinion on which stitch patterns work well with this yarn. Please feel free to give your opinion in the comments. And if you enjoyed this in-depth video, please give it a thumbs up to let YouTube know that this content is interesting. If you want to follow me, feel free to subscribe to my channel. I hope to update it much more frequently from now on. And if you want to know when I put out a new video, click the bell to receive the notifications. Thank you. See you soon. Bye.